Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm Jodie.
And I'm Matthew.
Quick disclaimer, we know what we know, and what we don't know, we try to learn.
Yeah, no, I suppose that's true. We know what. Say that again?
We know what we know, and what we don't know, we try to learn.
Yeah, no, we know what we know, and what we don't know, we try to learn. And that's what we're doing today. We're doing a new type of episode where we're talking about current events. Uh,
Imagine that.
so this will be exciting. I like the point of this podcast, as I think we've discussed before, is to try to increase religious literacy and talk about religion and understand religion so we can understand those around us and the world around us and the happenings. So what we're trying to do today is talk about the happenings of the world in a way that's hopefully generative and hopefully informative. Uh, so I'm excited. I don't know how you feel.
That was such a polite way to say some people think the world is going to hell in a handbag.
Sure. What I would continue to say is that with this podcast, I think I have somewhat of an authority, a very little, a very small amount to talk about religion and religion and culture. What I don't have authority or knowledge to talk about is politics and stuff like that. But when the two merge, we have to try to combine it. So recently, uh, President Trump announced the start of the White House Faith Office and an executive order to eradicate anti-Christian bias. So what we're hoping to do in this episode is to talk about that, to understand exactly what's happening, what these perspectives are coming from, and probably one of us more than the other are going to give many opinions on it.
Oh, hi. Did you call? You rang? I'm Jody, and I have no authority on speaking on religion or politics, but I'm a person who lives in the United States who has the ability to vote and voice an opinion. And while I'm going to try to keep it in, we'll do our best. Let's talk.
Yeah.
Let's get into it. Let's start
Yeah.
chronologically. An anti-Christian bias task force. What does that even mean?
Why is that chronologically first to you? Where does
It was the first thing that was released.
Was it? I thought this was all happening like around the same time.
It all
See, this is what
happened
we
around the
mean. We
same
don't know what we're
time.
talking about.
It all happened around the same time, but I'm saying in when it hit my TikTok.
Oh, sure. Chronologically for you.
Chronologically for my TikTok.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, the I heard about the White House Faith Office before I heard about the anti-Christian bias thing. Anyways, um
That's because our algorithms are different.
yeah. So anyways, uh Trump signed an executive order ordering the eradication of anti-Christian bias. That's the phrase that's used. So we've read through the executive order. Um, I don't know. I enjoy reading
Yeah.
these types of things. They're fun. So I mean, not fun in a good way, but fun in a like, oh, someone had to like write this down, and I love trying to think about what they thought about when writing this and who was the person that wrote it. I don't know, but this is fun to think about. But essentially, what happened in this executive order, and you let me know if you agree with this summary or not,
Mhm.
is that they set out a goal to end the anti-Christian weaponization of the government. I think that's the phrase that they used, and they justified this with four or five different stories of how Christians have been discriminated against, specifically by the government. So the solution was to create a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias that will identify unlawful anti-Christian policies, practices, and conducts. They'll recommend steps to terminate those policies. Is that a good brief summary, do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a great brief summary that they would do that. It is the material that was in it that I think had some issues for me because I agree, no government should be used to target specific religious groups. That is so
Right.
totally true. I agree with that. Um, it so they cited two federal laws. when doing all of this. The first being the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and Section 3, subsection A, which I had to learn how to read these, which was really fun last night. The government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability, except as provided in subsection B. The exception being the government may substantially burden a person's exercise of religion only if it demonstrates the application of the burden. You guys can go read this. Here's where I'm having an issue.
Okay.
How?
It's like you switched languages for a second. We went into legal speak, and I'm like, I don't know. That's none of my business.
I know, I'm like, back to layman's, Jodie, back to layman. But basically, the government can't impede on your right to practice religion. And when they were going through this stuff, when they were building this act, they referenced a few different things that happened. Like, if someone wanted to use peyote in a Native American ritual, and then they were later fired because they drug tested positive for something else, but it was during a religious ceremony.
Mm.
And so what would you do in that situation? Because yes, the drug's federally illegal, but the person was using it in a religious practice.
Right.
So the government can't impede on you. Does that make sense?
I'm tracking.
Okay. Here's my question, because the story that they are putting forward for why this task force is important is because people were blockading abortion clinics.
Mm.
How is protesting an abortion clinic a religious practice? Blockading an abortion clinic.
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, as I mentioned, the order referenced 4 or 5 different specific stories.
Yeah.
And I think that was like the first one that they mentioned. And it's referencing a 2021 incident in Tennessee, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And I think even in the bill, it said that it arrested like an 87-year-old woman and a Catholic priest or something, very intentionally, like written into the bill to play on people's emotions. Like,
A
oh,
father of 11.
sure, yeah. Um,
Which is not indicative of someone's unwillingness to blockade something. That doesn't, I kind of felt they were using that language to indicate, like, look at these people, how good they are. They're old, or a priest, or a father of 11.
right. Yeah, and it's a story that many people on the right like to tell, to say, look at how, because this was under the Biden administration when it happened. Like, look at how the Biden administration treats these Christians who are just trying to, promote their own belief. I don't know enough about the story to speak authoritatively on it. I don't know if they were assembling without, because like the right to assemble is like lawful, but you need permits and stuff like that. Maybe they didn't have a permit, but they were like blocking doors. Like that's not legal either.
They were inside the clinic.
Sure, I don't
They
know.
were they were in, well, not inside the clinic. They were inside the building that the clinic was in. And they were leading a rescue is the term. It's commonly known among anti-abortion activists as dissuading women from obtaining an abortion. I don't know if you've ever been to an abortion clinic. I have accompanied a friend there. I have seen the people leading rescues, and I will say it is usually fairly peaceful, but I've also seen videos where it's much less so.
Mm.
So it's a toss-up of how these people were engaging with the women who were entering the clinic. But
Yeah.
there are videos apparently from that day that show them blocking the entrances, which is against the law.
Right. No, I've had the opposite experience where I've had very conservative Christian friends invite me to protest abortion clinics. I did not go with them because they did it for Lent. They said, for Lent, I'm going to protest an abortion clinic every day, which is an interesting spiritual practice, I guess you could say, but not something that I particularly wanted to use my time for. Um, but no, it's very very interesting how this is presented. But the point of these, and then I don't think we need to focus on each one uh, too in depth. But the point of this one is that, like, hey, this is something we believe in, and abortion comes up again in these justifications. The next one is that they referenced over 100 attacks on Catholic churches, charities, and pro-life centers that sought justice against their violence, theft, and arson, which Biden supposedly ignored. Which, like, yeah, that's wrong. Having these attacks on churches and institutions stuff is bad. We need to do something about that, regardless of what religion they are, regardless of what political affiliation they are. We shouldn't have attacks on institutions like this. And the justification for a lot of these attacks were that either the church was affirming of abortion or that they were against abortion. And that's why the attacks happened for both reasons, for both opposing reasons. And I thought that was interesting how that was presented in because I don't think they mentioned that in the executive order. I was doing some extra research there.
No, I don't think they did. I don't think they did, because I was going through that, and I hate to go back and focus in on this, but it was the language that was used and the things they referenced, because they also referenced Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I'm assuming it's subsection J, where they talk about religion, as well as belief, all aspects of religious observance and practice, as well as belief, unless an employer demonstrates that he is unable to reasonably accommodate an employee's or prospective employee's religious observance. They basically cited the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a reason why this task force was important. So I'm assuming some people lost their jobs over this. I mean, they didn't really say why they were referencing that specific thing. I don't know. I felt kind of confused, and maybe that's because I don't know a lot about political science.
Right.
But I felt very confused reading this executive order, and I'm very confused now. I'm trying to understand, like, why do we need a specific anti-Christian bias task force, especially when he revoked the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, and that created the EEOC, which is the commission where, like, if you felt like you were being discriminated against because of religious, race, or other reasons, that entire commission was, I guess, as far as I understand, dissolved by revoking that act. So the people that these individuals who, if they felt they were being discriminated against, these people could have gone to, that's gone. But now they're putting in a task force specifically for anti-Christian bias.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with that other stuff. I don't know. I don't follow enough politics to speak on anything outside of, religion. I don't read in my politics or in my news. Like my main source of news is the religion news service because that's where I get the hard hitting recent news. So I don't know about all that, but no, that's interesting. And let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that the task force comes to the conclusion that, hey, we need to bring back these institutions where they can go to for religious bias against them. Like maybe that's what they'll conclude. Like we don't know. We're speculating here. I don't want to speak into the future and say this is like we don't know what this is going to do. We can speculate with some degree of probability of what we think this means, and I think that's fairly clear. But I don't know. I'm holding out hope that this can do good. Will it? Probably not. But I'm holding out hope that there's a possibility.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I keep going back to the abortion clinics because they kept saying it was the reason why because they said that the government was abusing the FACE Act, which is the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. And there was an uptick in people having this. There was an uptick in this act being used as a way to prosecute people after Roe v. Wade was overturned because
Okay.
they saw an uptick in protests at abortion clinics.
Who are
But
they?
I'm so glad you asked. So before Roe was overturned, the Justice Department oversaw a handful of FACE Act violation cases. This is from the AP News article on the 2021 Tennessee abortion clinic
Okay.
situation. In 2021, just 3 cases involving 3 defendants were charged, and in 2020, the agency handled just 1 case. By 2022, that number jumped to 11 cases involving 29 defendants, and last year there were 10 cases and 22 defendants. Advocates like the National Abortion Federation say the uptick in cases reflects the rise in harassment and violence abortion clinics have faced since state abortion bans have been allowed to go into effect. In a 2022 report, the organization said abortion providers across the U.S. saw noticeable spikes in the number of death threats, stalkings, burglaries, and arsons compared with the year prior. So, and I keep saying they because I'm trying to remain ambiguous, but the current administration is saying that the previous administration was misusing the FACE Act to prosecute Christians. But what's not being recognized is that the overturning of Roe v. Wade led to an uptick in protests. And perhaps that was why you saw an uptick in people being in violation of the FACE Act, not because they were pushing it more, but because there just were more protests.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we're necessarily in a position to say why these things happened. I can't speculate on that. I'm not knowledgeable enough on these things, but no, it's definitely a possibility.
No, but I think it's important for people to get all of the details because what I'm currently reading online
Mm-hmm.
is that people are feeling prosecuted, that people are
Right.
persecuted, that people are feeling like they can't have their own opinions and feelings
Right.
because then they're going to have the government targeting them.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's people going, and maybe I'm getting too stuck on the details, but
I think what we're seeing here is a story of two different communal narratives happening. We have the people that, and this bill or order references abortion a handful of times, but that's not what it's overall about. It's about that to some extent, but I think there's the communal narrative that says we're being oppressed by these new government agencies that are stopping access to abortion and that idea. And I think there's the other communal narratives that are in support of executive orders like this that are saying like good. And I think this executive order is relying specifically on language of suffering and trauma to try to justify a certain behavior, to try to justify their actions here. And I'm relying on work by Dr. Alexiana Fry, who's on social medias and stuff, a biblical religious scholar. So I'm relying on her thoughts here primarily. But the the fact that this bill is relying, it's not a bill, it's an order, that is utilizing language of trauma and suffering by referencing specific events, by referencing specific stories that have been constructed to present their own viewpoint. We have the two that we mentioned regarding abortion and how that affects the outlook. There's another where the order references where the FBI considered infiltrating radical traditionalist Catholic churches as threat mitigation. That I don't think they actually did. They just kind of threw it out there as an idea, and it was shut down because like, no, that's wrong. But so many people pick that up as, oh, they're against Catholicism now. Whereas I think what this bill or idea that was thrown out there is targeting a specific form of radical traditionalist Catholicism, which people like Mel, who's the Braveheart guy?
Gibson.
Mel Gibson. Like Mel Gibson is radical traditionalist Catholic. That's the kind of Christianity that he proposes. Very anti-Semitic, very, that branch of problematic Christianity that's kind of awful towards other people. I think that's what that bill was kind of putting out. And it also critiqued other things like Biden declaring the Transgender Day of Visibility that happened to correspond to Easter. Um, so it's this idea that they're presenting this idea of this narrative of, of trauma and suffering that is carefully constructed through these few stories to be like, hey, this is wrong. And that's not to say that some of these things were wrong. The attacks on churches and stuff like that, and like for
Totally
sure,
wrong.
are definitely wrong. There are, like, they're not completely misguided here. There are cases of bad things happening, but the fact that they're exploiting these feelings of trauma, I think the bill uses quite explicit language of trauma, to try to create this narrative of victimization and suffering can be reused to repress and suppress others. I think this, uh, uh, what is it, eradicating anti-Christian bias can just as easily be restated as promoting pro-Christian bias. And I think that's the problem with this bill that a lot of people are worried about and concerned about. It's that we're concerned with, not that we get rid of bias. I think we all agree that getting rid of bias, or trying to get rid of bias, I don't think we can actually get rid of bias, but trying to get rid of bias is good. But in effect, what is actually happening based on the language here and the previous language used in religious talk by this administration is that actually means we need a pro-Christian bias. And that's where it's problematic. That's where it's scary. And that's where we should try to step away from.
Because why? Hey, you're right. We're against any kind of bias. We're against anyone attacking anyone else because of religion.
Right.
And it needs to stay there. But when you put a specific religion's, it feels like interests ahead of the interest of just keeping all religions safe.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a very thin line that we are approaching.
Sure.
It's very interesting you brought up that FBI thing about them possibly wanting to infiltrate. Did you know in 2006, according to the ACLU, that the FBI sent in someone to infiltrate Muslim mosques in Orange County in California to kind of feel things out?
And that makes yeah, and I think it should be said that the idea to infiltrate Catholic churches was shut down because that was wrong, just as infiltrating mosques and stuff would be wrong.
But they did it anyways, and no
But they
one had
did.
an issue with it then.
The government did weird, schemy things. What?
Crazy.
Yeah.
And it's good to call it out, and it's good to like not allow the government to do that. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't put the interests of one religion ahead of everyone else's. Is that unfair to say?
No, that's right. But in practice, it's not possible. We can try and we can become aware. We can become aware of these biases, like for sure. But and this is what I talk about with biblical interpretation. Like we have these biases that we look at the Bible with, we look at text with. They are present, and no matter how hard we try to get rid of them, like they're still there. Like the government is going to have a bias towards a religion, towards some idea of stuff like that. It's going to be there. What we can do is try to be aware of that, which is why on paper, trying to get rid of an anti-Christian bias is good. In effect, what we're worried about is that eliminating an anti-Christian bias. We're worried that then creates anti-Jewish bias, that it then creates anti-Muslim bias, and that's the fear. That's what we don't want. Yeah. And the fact that this is focused only on eliminating anti-Christian bias and not, and I'm unaware of any real efforts to eliminate anti-Muslim bias or any other things presented by the Trump administration. I think that's telling. Like that's not to say that it's not there. I know a few days or weeks ago they released um, something about anti-Semitism, trying to fix anti-Semitism, which had no Jews on the board, or if they did, it had very few, and it was like very much. I didn't read the details of it specifically, so I can't speak too authoritatively on it, but it was very much not really taking into the concerns of real Jews and just kind of saying this is what we need for our political goals. So like it exists. Other attempts to get rid of these biases, to get rid of anti-Semitism, to get rid of racism exist, but it just may not look like what we think was going to be actually helpful.
They just don't have a task force.
They don't have a task force.
They just don't have a task force.
Yeah.
Speaking of things they also don't have, faith office.
Sure, faith
Is this
office.
a new thing?
Okay, so the White House faith office is a new title. I think the role kind of goes back to the Bush administration. He called it something different. Bush called it the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. And then Obama and then later Biden like kind of revamped it as the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. So like this office, the White House Faith Office has existed in some form or another since early 2001. So like this isn't entirely new. I've seen a lot of things on social media, particular that's like, this is crazy. They're starting a faith office. That's wild. And it's been around for 20 years, 25 years. So like that in its own thing, I don't think should be any call for concern, should be anything we should be afraid of.
Okay. That's okay. Well then, yeah,
Yeah.
I can roll with that. And what I read is that they work with nonprofits and other such organizations to community build, I guess, is from what I understand from my readings.
Yeah, no, it's I think these programs are primarily there to strengthen faith-based community organizations to kind of expand their ability to provide federally funded social services, which I think is a good thing. Like I think like that's great. The problems like which have come with critiques of this is that like how does this deal with the separation of church and state and what that means? Well, and that has some critiques, but I think in those organizations, if I'm correct, there are restrictions on funds used to support inherently religious worship services or prayer services or like religious instruction or proselytizing or anything like that. So I think there were like the funds were intentional to not be there to try to convert people to their religion, but there to help communities and social needs that were necessary. So I think I think this is good. I think having that organization does good for the communities that need it. So I'm not concerned about the White House Faith Office. This is in theory, until we talk about the details. Like this is in theory a thing that can do good.
I was gonna say you're not concerned at all. You have no concerns. You can't think of anything.
I have no concerns about the idea of it, the concept of it.
The concept. What about the execution? What about the leadership?
Yeah, no, so he announced Paula White was going to be the leader of it. And I think she gets a bad rap. Perhaps justified, perhaps not. We'll talk about it. Jodie, what are your thoughts?
Listen, from what I've seen and read, it is the kind of Christianity that made me stop going to church, to be as polite as possible. She very much gives off a divisive energy. And to me, that kind of spirituality only achieves and helps those in that particular sect and does not work towards the betterment of world, the world as a whole.
Right.
And that to me isn't something you want in your administration. But
Mm,
I do believe her being appointed in that position is a reflection of this administration.
sure. Yeah, so let's talk about that a little, and then we'll talk about how this all works together.
Yeah.
Um, but Paula White I know nothing about Paula White really, like personally. I know that she's a big voice in charismatic Christianity. I know she's a big voice in prosperity gospel, and I know she's a big voice in spiritual warfare. That's about all I know about her. There's allegate she's got a few divorces out there that some people are real upset about, but that I don't know anything about that. But I know about the Christianities that she's associated with. So let's talk about that. Let's start with charismatic Christianity. Uh,
What is that?
yeah. So when you think of charismatic Christianity, you might think of Pentecostalism. That might be like what you associate with, if you know anything about Pentecostalism.
Speaking in tongues.
Yeah, no, speaking in tongues is definitely part of it. Um, the idea of gifts and spirits of prophecy, that's another big part of it, speaking prophetically. Uh, they do other things like being slain in the spirit. You might have seen like Benny Hinn videos. I think he's kind of famous for his videos on that. Holy laughing, that's another thing in charismatic Christianity. Kenneth Copeland does a lot of that stuff. And it's these very emotional responses to the Holy Spirit. The point of this charismatic Christianity is to focus on a direct communication through to God through the Holy Spirit. And they expect miracles, they expect healings. It's that branch of Christianity. And I think when Christians see Paula White doing the things that Paula White does, they don't realize this is a completely different way of talking, a completely different way of doing Christianity than they might be familiar with. Um, so I know I saw a video kind of with a bunch of short little clips of Paula White, like, oh, Paula White's crazy. And I think a lot of that was taken out of context. Speaking in tongues, I think that's a big one that people get freaked out about. Like, oh, this is crazy, but that's a very genuine way of doing spirituality. It's a very genuine. It's a very genuine, very common way to do spirituality, and there's a lot of different religions that do similar type things with it. But it's particularly in Pentecostalism and charismatic Christianity, this is a relatively normal thing to do. And I think by looking at that and saying, oh, that's weird, that's normal, we're not understanding social circumstances correctly. And I think that's something we should take into consideration when looking at people like Paula White.
You know what? I'm going to say something. I celebrate Paula White for this expression of her spirituality. I celebrate Pentecostalism. In the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, Mary
Okay.
Cosby, she's one of the housewives. She is the, I forget what she calls herself, but she's basically the pastor of a Pentecostal church. And so
Okay.
now that I'm remembering like Mary, but the practice itself, like how she practices her religion, is her own journey. It is her own decision. It is if she is allowed to practice. If she's not harming anyone. I'm sorry,
Right.
who is she harming by speaking in tongues?
Right.
Who is I can only assume what holy laughing is unless you'd like to give a demonstration.
I would not like to give a demonstration, but essentially you just kind of start laughing, and then you start laughing, and then you like really start laughing. And it's just the Holy Spirit chilling. You're just like, yeah, Holy Spirit, we're laughing, we're having a good time.
If that is how you communicate with your spiritual guide, then that is beautiful. And that is a beautiful expression. And laughter is the best medicine.
Yeah.
I
Like
mean,
if you don't know what's going on, if you're not expecting it, if you don't know the culture, it can freak you out. Like it can be a weird thing to be around for sure. But as part of the culture, as part of the religious experience, like it's normal. It's a way that people do Christianity. It's a valid way of doing Christianity.
yeah, no, I can get down with that.
Right.
I see that. I see that appeal. So then that's not the issue.
Sure. That's not the issue. Well, it's the issue to some people. Some Christians are like, whoa. And Paula White has garnered some criticism from a lot of Trump supporters because she's that branch of charismatic Christianity. It kind of freaks a lot of people out. Also, she's a woman. That freaks a lot of other people out. She's a woman pastor, which,
How
is
dare.
a big no-no in a lot of conservative evangelical denominations. So she has garnered her fair share of complaints. But the other thing that she's known for is the prosperity gospel, which is, I think, something that you'll take a much bigger umbrage with.
Yeah.
So yeah, that the idea of the prosperity gospel essentially is that God wants you to be rich and healthy, and wealth is a sign of God's favor. And this is primarily justified on uh, 3 John 1:2, I think, and basically saying like, I hope like this all goes well with you and like you have good health, and it's, they base it on other things too, but it's this idea that if you do good things in the sight of God, you will become rich and wealthy. And this is why Trump is in particular put up in such high light in prosperity gospel circles, because they say, oh, he's rich, he's wealthy, he must be favored by God. Like that's a line of thinking that is not uncommon in prosperity gospel circles. You seem perplexed, displeased, confused.
Well, then that just kind of leads to the whole generational wealth. If you are born with this wealth, then are you ordained by God to be this just amazing person?
Mm,
I think that's kind of the logic they were using when they had kings. Um,
yeah.
it's very much disassociated from the
Mm,
fact that some people are just not born into those circumstances. Some
right.
people don't get the opportunities, whether that's for systemic reasons or just circumstances, because bad things do befall people, not necessarily for a reason. I see. I see how we end up in this. I have to say, I think at one point, maybe I did believe in prosperity gospel, like to a certain extent, that if you are good in the eyes of the Lord, you are rewarded.
Mm,
And I see how that thought happens, but it very much feels to me divisive, because then what about the people who aren't rich? Does that truly mean they're not good?
right. And this is where prosperity gospel gets its big critique from Christians and from non-Christians alike. The idea of that it often preys on um, the vulnerable and poor, in the sense that a lot of times they'll say, if you, it's often called a seed. If you give us this seed, your wealth will increase 100-fold. So the more money you give us, the more money you donate to this church, the more money God will give back to you. So you'll see a lot of these televangelist uh, people in prosperity gospel saying, "Hey, if you give us $100, God's going to bless you $100,000 or something along the lines of that." So those predatory practices of getting people to donate to their church, their institution, is where it can get problematic. And the idea that God blessing you with wealth is why so many of these pastors have mansions and planes and yachts and stuff like that, is because they see that as a sign of God's blessing. You don't want a pastor who's poor, because that means God doesn't bless you. That's the idea of this prosperity gospel.
I know you hate when I do this, but this sounds very similar to the Scientology stuff. The idea
Sure.
that if you give some, if you start, planting that seed,
Mm-hmm.
and if you do that, and then other things will also grow with you. That is just a similarity I'm drawing. I'm not saying anything from it. That's just what it reminded me of. Um,
Right. But the idea is, we think that a lot of people are against this. Even in Christianity, I know a lot of Christian circles, they look at this and are like, no, this is bad. I think, and these are my notes that I found from undergrad, so this is dated information, and I don't know if it's reliable. But said that 17% of American Christians explicitly identify with the prosperity gospel, and 2/3 believe that God wants us to be wealthy. So the idea of the prosperity gospel as it isn't as much of a minority view as we might think it is. It's fairly common to some extent. Uh, so I think we should wonder how this interacts with American Christianity. If this is a fairly substantial chunk of Christians, like it's definitely worth considering and understanding.
Hey, but wouldn't God want everyone to be wealthy? Wouldn't God want everyone to prosper? That's what
Hey,
I took from.
I'm not a theologian. I can't speak on behalf of God.
I know, but it just seems like a elite special group that people are trying to buy to be a part of, so they can also be a part of the elite special group, and they can also be wealthy and they get to go to heaven, and it feels very exclusive.
Mm,
And
yeah. And but who's to say that's not how you practice religion? Like that's a genuine way of practicing religion. I don't think it's my role uh, as a scholar to say this is the correct way to do religion or this is the wrong way to do religion. This is a way that people do religion, and unless you want to be part of that, unless you want to step inside the conversation and say no, this is me being in here, I don't think I have the authority to say this is right or wrong. I'm not a theologian. I can't say what God wants, what God does, what God is. I as a religious studies guy uh, can say this is what other people do. I don't know. I personally disagree with it, but that doesn't mean it's not true for them and it's not helpful for them. Because a lot of people, I think, get a lot of good things from the prosperity gospel. I think
yeah,
it makes them happy. It gives them their spiritual needs. It gives them what they need. And just because we're saying they're being exploited because they're donating all their money because one day they'll get all their riches back, it's exploitative in that sense, but it's worth it to a lot of people, I think.
this would be the face of begrudging if you looked it up in the dictionary, because you're right, and I'm not a scholar, um but you're like, yeah, no, that is a way to practice. That is
Yeah.
a way to practice, but it's just, who was running this office before? Was it also pastors and stuff with ideologies like this?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think primarily it was I think Bush had some political scientists, he had some like religious studies scholars. Um, I think the same for Biden and Obama. For the most part, or they had like some religious affiliations and stuff like that. But they're generally like politicians, that type of vibe. Um, I think Paula White being the head of this is like the first like mega church pastor in that sense. Um, but that's not to say that presidents don't have spiritual advisors and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Billy Graham was a spiritual advisor for decades to all sorts of different presidents. But no, before we move on from that, the other thing that Paula White is associated with is spiritual warfare, and I think that's very important
Yeah.
to talk about here, because that ties into prosperity gospel and charismatic Christianity. Because in the prosperity gospel, part of it is that the devil wants to keep us down, but Christ is victorious. There's this idea that the faith is the necessary activator for blessings. You have to name it and claim it. You have to be specific with what you want so that God will give it to you. But at the same time, there's demonic forces and the devil that are actively fighting against Christians, these particular Christians. So this it's idea that there are spiritual forces and demons out there working to bring us down, and we need to fight those. And oftentimes in these evangelical charismatic situations, it's things that align with politically right ideologies that are good that we're fighting for, and the demons are fighting for worldly things, is what they'll call it, or um, you know, progressive ideologies and stuff like that is what they'll phrase it as, like the devil fighting against. In a sense, it's anything that threatens to redistribute power in a way that doesn't benefit the one in spiritual warfare is a result of the demonic forces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I just feel like we're platforming one way of thinking, one way of living life as being the one correct way. I feel like that's what's happening here.
Right. No, that's definitely what's happening in that form of Christian. And this is why Paula White says things like Black Lives Matter is satan, or she doesn't say it's satanic. She says it's antichrist. Like that's like obviously wrong and like bad. She shouldn't be saying those things, but it's also the way that these charismatic preachers talk about spiritual warfare in that sense. It's this specific genre of speaking that we should be aware of to understand more where she's coming from, which is wrong and messed up. And like obviously Black Lives Matter isn't the Antichrist, but no, it is definitely worth thinking about.
It's all of these, like the charismatic Christianity aside, if we're looking at the prosperity gospel and the spiritual warfare, I think it is just taking one small
Mhm.
section of people. It is saying, you are the chosen people, you are the people who deserve all of the great things, and we need to make sure you guys are taken care of, and putting their needs above the needs of everyone else. And I'm just seeing that, or it that thinking as a reflection of like the way, and I know we are not political science majors, we don't really have a lot of authority to talk about politics, but normal people need to get interested in politics. It in my opinion, it needs to happen, because what's happening right now is the needs and the wants of the United States are, we're trying to put those ahead of the needs of the rest of the world, and we're all human beings, and this is my own spirituality coming through, because I'm like, we're all human beings. Why can't we care about everyone? We drew these lines in the countries. We decided what this would look like. We could literally do whatever we wanted on this earth.
Mhm.
We could literally make heaven on earth.
Right. Okay.
And instead, we're doing this. And I'm sorry, I'm getting
No,
like,
no, this is, but I think things like this is exactly what this branch of Christianity thinks. I think they would agree with you in what you just said, but not in practice. Like this is why um, this is manifest destiny all over again. Um, the idea of the westward expansion of the U.S. that is their God-given right to take over this land, to make it this utopia of all the people there. To it's their God. And even in Trump's inauguration speech, he mentioned manifest destiny in relation to the moon and Mars and stuff. But like the idea of manifest destiny of dominion theology, that where this specific group of Christians have the authority and grace from God to make America this Christian nation, to make the world very Christian from their idea. The idea that God gave them this blessing and authority to do that, I think is very pervasive in this form of Christianity. And this is why you get Trump threatening to buy Greenland or Panama or Palestine. Like it's the idea that they think God gave them dominion to have this very specific idea of Christianity for everyone, and that's an everyone idea, and that's what we should be scared of. That's what should cause us a little bit of fear.
it feels like they think only their club
Yeah.
gets to play on the playground. Only those kids get to be on the playground, but everyone should get to be on the playground. We should all, no matter what you believe or how you believe it. I mean, obviously, I am going to have some limits here. Like, if you kill or murder someone, like, we're going to need to have a conversation. Um, but it's like, you can't even get to, how are you hating from the outside the club? You can't even get in, is kind of the
Right.
lyric that comes to mind.
Is that Taylor Swift?
No,
Uh,
my, sorry, more of my own. my other side coming through. I just, like, I see why people get scared. I see why there is a lot of fear online.
Mm.
And these appointments have created more fear. This task force has created fear. And it seems like there are a lot of Christians who want to cover their ears and say, oh, well, you're just mad because it's not benefiting your satanic ways. And I don't think that's right, because I'll get too far deep into why I think that's not right.
No, I think that there's just a lot of this is why I think this is why we want to do this podcast. We want to explore religion, how religion works, what people believe, what those around us believe, and how that plays out in modern times in our day-to-day activities. And I think learning how to have discussions that are cordial and helpful are necessary. So I don't know. Like you said, everyone needs to learn about politics. I don't know. I don't know about all that. Do we need politics? I mean, maybe. I don't know. But we need to learn about religion. That's something I'll stand for. We need to learn about religion because it affects so many of us, either personally through people's own spiritualities and religions, or through policies of other people's spiritualities and religion. And just being able to engage with other people and not othering them and not seeing them as distant and being scared of them, I think is so important. And I think that it there's this fear of the other side. There's if we want to split this in two sides, there's the the Christians that are pro Trump and all that stuff, and pro this executive order, and pro Paula White and all that. And then there's the other group of people, the Christians that aren't supporting that, the people of other faiths that aren't supporting that. We have these two different groups, and I think it's very easy for both groups to other each other. And I think when we other each other, we see the other group as less than human from whichever side you're on. It it causes a lot of fear, causes there's a lot of unknowing of what the other person actually believes, and it causes discrimination, it causes hate, and I think we can all agree that's bad.
That kind of reminds me of one of our earlier comments we got on Instagram was, is this pro-Christian or anti-Christian?
Mm,
Our podcast.
yeah,
And people went so eagerly to define what they don't agree with as being anti-Christian,
yeah,
even if it's just a different view on Christianity.
right.
I don't know. I feel like there needs to be a reconciliation. I don't know if there will be.
Right. I think before we get reconciliation, we just need to know more. We just need to be open to learning.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
unprecedented times we live in.
It's always unprecedented times. This is completely precedented. We all are expecting chaos. That's anticipated. We love the chaos. We live for the chaos. It gives us stuff to talk about, I guess. But I think we talked about all of the things that we were going to talk about. I don't know if we talked about it well. I don't know if we talked about it coherently.
I don't know if
But
this will get posted.
gosh golly, we talked about it.
We talked.
Yeah. Is there anything that you felt like we left out?
No, but I feel calmer.
Perfect. Sweet. Well, thank you for listening to this wild, crazy, fun podcast episode. I'm sure no one will have thoughts that differ from us. But if you happen to disagree with us, let us know. Give us your ideas. Tell us what we did wrong so that we can learn with you. But let's do it in a nice way, please.
Or not. Hey, it's your life, your freedom.
Right. If you can't do it in a nice way, fine, I guess.
If we could just avoid racially charged slurs, that'd be great.
But yeah, follow us Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Love YouTube, I guess. We're on Spotify and Apple and wherever else you get podcasts. We technically have a Twitter account and a Bluesky account and a Facebook. Follow us wherever and have
Honestly,
fun with
just
it.
engage. Just
Just
engage.
yeah, ask us
Matthew
questions.
loves
We'll
to
answer
talk.
them.
He's a professional yapper.
It's true.
I might block you. Who knows?
Perfect. All right. Thanks all for listening. Bye.
Bye. Did I embarrass you too much?
No, I had fun. I love
Okay.
talking about this stuff. Are we right? I don't know. Probably not. But I had
Probably
fun.
not.